When I talk about the end of Nintendo, it's important to understand that I do not mean this financially. This video is not me predicting some sort of economic downturn for the company. To the contrary, actually, I think Nintendo have a very solid money-making strategy laid out ahead of them that they are following that has been established by giant media conglomerates before them, like Disney. So no, I'm not talking about the end of Nintendo in terms of money. I'm talking about the end of Nintendo in terms of creative identity, their artistic output, their approach and philosophy that has gotten them where they are today. And I've noticed just generally talking about stuff like creative identity in video games is a pretty complicated conversation because one, it takes usually a lot of people and a lot of moving parts to create games. And so what ends up happening is that most players associate the creation of a game to the logo stamped on the front of the case. Every once in a while, we will recognize directors like Shigeru Miyamoto or Kojima or Mikami, but do we ever really heavily associate a game's creation with the creative team in a specific time with a specific philosophy? Usually we don't. This is what I think is really prevalent in remake culture, where you can take a game that is supposedly remaking another game that doesn't have any of the connecting threads between the two. The original team isn't involved. It's many decades later. The approach to the design is completely different. It's just a whole new game with a fresh set of skin and that same logo stamped on the front. And as critics and players were like, that's valid, right? So when it comes to the direction of companies, we really struggle to identify when a company's creative output is starting to change or when their creative philosophy is starting to change, and we really struggle to evaluate that. A very obvious example of this is when Squaresoft ended and it became Square Enix. Of course, if you talk to Final Fantasy fans these days, they'll all point to that moment and be like, okay, that was the end of Squaresoft, kind of, right? And the Final Fantasy, as we knew it, shifted. That all being said, when the new Final Fantasy game is released by Square Enix, it's like, oh, this is part of the canon. This is part of the whole thing. So what I'm getting at is we really struggle to parse out individual identity in game creation. And then you take an even further step back and we talk about the identity of a company. That is a whole mess and a whole complicated thing. And what usually ends up happening is we see this gradual shift from the ethos a company had at one point to an entirely new ethos that basically changes their entire identity. But because that shift is so gradual and because we have such a connection and loyalty to the brand, these conversations usually just come back to brand loyalty and the discussion of finances. And I notice this really distinctly when it comes to Western gaming media. Whenever you're asked to assess how a gaming company is doing, a lot of that almost always goes back to how well are they doing financially. We're all pretending to be these little market analysts for some reason because God knows the world doesn't have enough of those. Case in point, I remember very distinctly the Iwata era of Nintendo and the conversation around the Iwata era, which I think is really interesting. And looking back on Nintendo history now, it's kind of funny. I'm a very hardcore guy. I'm not the biggest Nintendo fan, so I think you would naturally assume my least favorite era of Nintendo would be the Iwata era. But as I've gone through looking at Nintendo history and kind of analyzing their games, I think for one thing, the early era of Nintendo is really extremely overrated. There was a lot of crazy shit going on back there in the early era of Nintendo that gets glossed over very smoothly. For example, all of the monopolistic practices that old school Nintendo was engaging in. Because Nintendo, if you look back at their history, actually come from a more shady origin involving gambling and organized crime and love hotels, and then the really draconian licensing deals that they made developers engage in when they ran the markets during the NES era and stuff like that. So early Nintendo has this kind of mafia feel to it that isn't as warm and fuzzy as we look back on these days. And then they kind of struggle to find their footing in that 3D era. The 64 was not very forward thinking, but the real shifting point for me with Nintendo, the era where I think Nintendo were the most innovative and doing things that I think were very interesting, was the Iwata era. And I do think there is a very specific reason for this and why we are not going to see this return in what I like to call the modern Disney era of Nintendo. Because when you look at the presidents of Nintendo, Iwata is a massive outlier. So you have the first president, like I said, he's got this kind of like mafia boss energy. Then I think the second president was related to him, so just passing it down the dynasty. And then you get to Iwata later on, and Iwata comes from HAL Laboratory, and Iwata has the distinction of being a game programmer and developer. And I think that distinction is incredibly important, and why this era of Nintendo is the most interesting and innovative, and why he was doing things that I don't think are fully appreciated by hardcore gamers. And I think the gamers' relationship with Iwata's Wii, WiiU, 3DS, DS, even Switch era goes in this kind of U shape, where Iwata went out and he was trying to use his blue ocean philosophy, which is to bring in a whole new demographic of gamers, to reach to people who normally wouldn't play Xbox and PlayStation, and get them to play a console and games they never would. We saw this with the Wii. It was a massive success. And when the Wii came in, it was bringing in actually a lot of concepts and ideas that I think Sega were reaching for near the end of the lifespan. What's interesting is if you look at the Dreamcast, there's a lot of talk of what was the natural successor to the Dreamcast. And yes, I know Sega worked with Microsoft, and the original Xbox ended up inheriting a lot of Dreamcast stuff. And there was a close connection there. But I mean, in terms of overall philosophy, I think what the Wii did was something that Sega was definitely exploring in their later lifespan, which was bringing that physical interaction with games that you get in arcades, bringing that into the player's home. So when you talk about the WiiU era, there's this funny U shape that occurs where a lot of the stuff on the Wii is famously ultra casual. It's going to appeal to the average non-gamer like Wii Sports. But then the Wii also has these kind of hardcore arcade titles like Sin and Punishment Star Successor and Mad World. So you have this funny dynamic happening where on one hand, I like to think of the Wii as an arcade, and a lot of the more popular stuff are like those ticket games at the arcade, like Skee Ball and stuff. Those are the popular Wii titles, but then nestled in there, you've got some real gems and real classics. There's a lot of this sort of more arcade eccentric stuff happening on the Wii. And the reason for that is I think the Wii's design philosophy is something that Microsoft and PlayStation were not going to explore. I don't think modern Nintendo have any interest in exploring. And it was a much more visionary concept, which was basically make video games more physically interactive. And I think this is such an important concept, and a concept that is really underrated and underappreciated, especially these days, because I've seen a lot of video game discussion and reviews and essays these days where a lot of people seem to think that the ultimate form of game design is removing physical interaction with the game in every fashion. That games should just be controlled with the mind and pure strategy and all that kind of crap.
See, Yahtzee and I were discussing the other day how to do controls, and you want to minimize how much brain power is needed for people to interact with the game via the controller itself. And in an ideal world, you would want the player to think about something happening and then have its translation in-game.
I definitely disagree with that, because ultimately I think it makes game design more shallow, not deeper. The physical peripherals that you interact with while playing games, they aren't barriers to you interacting with the game. They are a fundamental part of the game. Imagine how fighting games would be influenced if you removed arcade sticks or controllers or inputs. You don't have Korean backdash anymore. Why have a Korean backdash? You don't have electrics anymore. You don't have supers anymore in a real sense. You see this with a lot of modern fighting games, actually. And then rhythm games. What becomes of rhythm games or even shmups? Part of the fundamental skills of dodging in shmups is executing the input. If you could just see the gap and instantly go there, where's the ultimate challenge of the game? Where's the risk reward, the trade-offs? This happens a lot with game balancing as well. This is why if you're playing an FPS, a first-person shooter, it's cheating to use those automatic aimers in the game, because part of the game and part of the risk reward is manually getting your sight lined up. And then, of course, Melee. Imagine Melee without execution. And then on the strategy side of things, Brood War. Part of what makes Brood War so exciting, and by far my favorite strategy game, is the insane execution involved, the APM. I mean, that is what makes the game so interesting and cool and deep, and why I think StarCraft 2 is lame, is a lot of those elements went away in that game. And so when it comes to this era of Nintendo, this concept Iwata was pushing forward, I think was very distinctive and I think very healthy for game development and Nintendo fans. Resident Evil 4 with light gun style aiming, you have my attention. There was just a lot of cool stuff coming out at this time, and yet the only thing a lot of people talked about when it came to Nintendo and their output, most talk was about how Nintendo should just go back to trying to make stuff like Microsoft and PlayStation. I remember hearing this very distinctly, and then of course Iwata himself got in very big trouble with the higher-ups because of the loss of money and the fail of the Wii U. And I'd like to take a moment to recognize what a homie Iwata was when he acted as president of Nintendo. There's the famous story where during the dark ages of the Wii U, there was a downturn in the profits of Nintendo. So he took half of his pay cut in order to ensure the job security of the employees beneath him. That's a really awesome move and something I think really rare from someone in his position. But coming from that game design background, coming from the background of a guy who's worked in these teams, I think he understood the value of these types of employees probably a lot better than a lot of other presidents tend to. And he just seemed genuinely very interested in game design as an art form and not just as a product.
On my business card, I am a corporate president. In my mind, I am a game developer. But in my heart, I am a gamer.
This was reflected in his adversity to mobile gaming for a very long time. Near the end there, he started to sort of chip away, and kind of, okay, we'll give a bit. But you should see some of the stuff he says throughout his time as president. He is definitely speaking some fire when it comes to a lot of the issues with mobile games and how they just focus on quantity over quality. And he wants to ensure Nintendo's work is high quality and all that good stuff. So, yeah, it's just a stance that doesn't make sense if you're just looking at financial trends and money. And so, poor Iwata. At the end there, he kind of got punished for his stances on gaming, but I think it really has made his legacy something special in the end. And so, back to the Wii U.
WiiU.
It's very Sega-like in that respect, and also without the gamble of the Wii U, I don't think they would have found the exact right combination they needed to with the Switch. And that being said, as much as I like the Switch, ultimately I think it is not Iwata's best creation. I think probably one of his best creations, one of my favorites, is the DS and the 3DS. And what's really great about this generation of handhelds is that over time, I think we're finding that the DS and 3DS are way better and more iconic than the Switch in terms of handheld design, the clamshell, the fact you can like throw it down a staircase. My kids have DSs and they love them and play the shit out of them. You hand them a Switch and it's like, this is a tablet. You've handed me a tablet. The DS is like a system. And then the 2 screens, even these days when you go to emulate it, you know, you can't get that same experience on an emulator because once again, he's really incorporating physical design with game design, that dual screen setup. I'm sad that Nintendo ended up abandoning it because it had so many cool aspects and things you could do with it, and some games made extremely great use of it. Bog Hog loves this hospital game. It's very action-like, and you can only really pull it off with the stylus. There's a lot of stuff that you just aren't going to see happen anymore because Nintendo have abandoned, I think they have abandoned, the physical design of their hardware with their game design. And that's something only a hardware/game development company could pull off. You need both branches to make this fusion happen. And really, we've only seen 2 companies really pursue this. Sega, which flopped and died underneath them, and Nintendo, which began to really struggle. And so I think they've pulled back on that, abandoned that, no longer seem to be pursuing that. And I remember reading this book over a decade ago called How Super Mario Conquered America. And overall, it's very much a Nintendo-centric fanboy perspective of the company that really glosses over some of the shadier origins and paints this really like David versus Goliath view of Nintendo and how they saved gaming, you know, the whole Nintendo gospel thing. But what saves the book, in my opinion, and always makes it stick out in my mind, was that it was written from a Nintendo fanboy's perspective during the Iwata era. And so the book ends with this sort of prediction of where's Nintendo going in the future. In the year 2011, what did Nintendo fans think of the company and what did they think was on the horizon? And during the Iwata era, I thought their outlook was very interesting and healthier, which they're talking about how it would be great if Iwata continued to push this balance of physical hardware design with game design and would see this really strong integration between the two that would grow gaming more generally, and this very arcade style vision of what game design could look like in the future. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking this vision is VR essentially, but I think there's a very important distinction to draw between the Wii and the WiiU and VR, at least for me personally, because VR is more about trying to immerse your senses into the game design and so forth, which is actually much more along the lines of what modern gamers are looking for, much more like controlling the game with your mind and changing and manipulating your senses to be in the game. Where I'm talking more about arcade style design, where Silent Scope, for example, you're not immersed in Silent Scope. You don't think you're actually in a city fighting crime. It's that you're given this unique peripheral, this sniper rifle, and the game is designed around mastering this peripheral and navigating it with the game design. And so Silent Scope, for example, you could never emulate that game. It could only ever be played faithfully on the arcade machine itself because you need that peripheral of the sniper rifle plus the little scope thing, which ends up being really difficult, by the way. It's one of the most difficult arcade games I've ever played. So that's the type of thing I'm talking about, is you're not trying to remove the reality of the physical world and trick your senses. You're just trying to master a physical object in relation to games. So light gun games are like this, rhythm games are like this. And yes, you can do this stuff in VR, but that tends not to be its main selling point from what I've seen. So VR is interesting, but it's not exactly the same thing. I just wanted to make that clear. But to be fair to VR, I do think it does have the potential for this style of design in the future. It's just right now we're still getting the basics established, and it looks like most people using VR, I checked on Steam, are using it with driving games and using it as sort of just a screen where you can look all around. But I think when we get to the point where we're able to build VR into peripherals and into more physical types of objects rather than just high-powered computers, I think that's when its real potential is going to get unlocked. And it looks like Iwata had a similar view. I checked back on a quote from 2016, and he said that he was interested in VR but felt the technology wasn't quite there yet. And so I think that is a similar view between the two of us, where it has the potential, but it's not quite there yet. And the trends seem to be it going more towards the immersion sort of thing rather than trying to make it physically integrated like arcade game design. And so now that the Iwata era has ended, unfortunately, what is 2024 current day Nintendo's approach? And having paid attention to them over the past few years, I think it's actually very clear what their current approach is. And I want to call this the Disney era of Nintendo, because if you look who is the president of Nintendo right now, he is not a game developer. He doesn't seem to have any connection with game development. Instead, he is much more like a Western studio president, where he is a money man. He is involved in the finances of Nintendo and rose the ranks through Nintendo through the financial department, which seems to be what is really happening with AAA design overall. And it's a really unfortunate trend, because what do you get when you have people who are in charge of the company just literally trained on maximum profits and gaining as much profits as possible? Well, you get the Disney effect. You lose that visionary approach that Iwata had, that blue ocean approach. You can't have a money man in charge of a creative endeavor like that, because he's not going to have the visionary outlook of like, okay, we're sanding against the grain here, but ultimately it's going to lead to something really awesome and interesting that could be beneficial money-wise in the future, like the Wii was, or could explode in your face like the Wii U did, and like what a lot of Sega ended up doing. And that's just the natural risk and reward of visionary development. You get major gains, but also it can be really risky. And in today's economy, in today's sort of media environment, that is not how it's done. Instead, everyone wants just very safe revenue. And in fact, Iwata was very critical of this when he was president. He said, hey, Nintendo is a very financially, creatively, overly careful company. They're not taking those innovative risks. And so it's no wonder we have not seen a new piece of hardware from Nintendo in the past 7 years. When was the last time something came out and you're like, oh, you've got to play it on the Switch because it utilizes all of these sick hardware features that only the Switch has? What hardware features does the Switch even have that other competitors can't do, especially the Steam Deck? I have a Steam Deck, I have a Switch. I hardly ever play my Switch anymore because the deck serves all of the functionality, but does it in a much more open-ended fashion with a vastly stronger, better library and just more user friendliness. And how is Nintendo going to respond to this? They're going to have to come up with something really radical, and they haven't really been building off of all the stuff they established earlier. The 3DS, that's gone. That dual screen stuff, that's all gone. And then on the game development side of things, when was the last time Nintendo released something really impressive that got your attention, even if you weren't a Nintendo fan, that made you think, oh, maybe I should pick up one of these Switches and try it out? It genuinely feels like the last time that happened was Breath of the Wild. Since that point, there are other bits of output. Tears of the Kingdom, it's like, eh. And then Super Mario Bros.
Wonder?
That's really lame. And apparently they released a new Zelda game that I wasn't even aware of until researching this video pretty much. So yeah, it's just been very standard and quiet and just playing it extremely safe. And I think that's what they're just going to continue to do, except when it comes to lawsuits. That's where Nintendo is putting a lot of time and effort and are making the headlines. They're making headlines in court, but not on your game console. So what is the game plan here? I think the answer is very clear. Hardware design, game development, Yes, Nintendo will continue probably to put out a Switch 2, sort of ceremonially, and they'll put out their most lucrative IPs ceremonially, like the recent output they've had. Pretty lame, honestly. So where is Nintendo's future? Look at Big Mickey Mouse. It is in that media franchising merch, baby. Merch. That is where the money is. And so what we're going to see Nintendo doing, this is my prediction, is they're going to become less and less of a video game company and more of a general media company. Yes, they'll still put out games and so forth, but it's more of that sort of legacy plan. And it's going to work because Nintendo, when it comes to media, when it comes to merchandise, when it comes to cultural capital, it is giant oil reserves. There is so much untapped potential. You can see them in the boardroom just salivating. The Super Mario Bros. Movie did super well. They're going to do Zelda. They're going to make more and more stuff. Pokemon, make that even more. And then, like Disney, get super aggressive with copyright. Just annihilate anything that threatens this legacy approach, because on top of multimedia merch and all that sort of stuff, now we're going to see just reselling you the legacy. Collections, remasters, remakes. I mean, it's a gold mine, baby. And the Nintendo fan base is perfect for this approach. They have been trained, I being one of these people, trained since birth to embrace Nintendo's ultimate destiny. I mean, look at me. I went into the mall. I saw this Zelda Ocarina of Time shirt, a game that I have massive nostalgia for, even though when I look at the game design more critically, I'm like, yeah, okay, it's not the greatest thing ever, but that title screen comes on, you hear Epona, you hear the music, you see the graphics. It just gets me every single time. And I start playing, and then it takes me about an hour and a half to realize, okay, this is kind of slow-paced and boring, but that nostalgia is just really ingrained in our generation, and Nintendo can just ride on that beautifully. And I don't think they're going to have really any obstacles in the way. And the sad consequence of this, because honestly, I think it would be fine, and I wouldn't really care that much, except the collateral damage that is going to be inflicted on game preservation, game emulation, getting access to legacy retro games. All of that stuff needs to be sacrificed at the altar of copyright enforcement to make sure Nintendo's bottom line stays nice and steady without having to be innovative, without having to take risks and make new things. And as much as us, dedicated gamers will complain about it and say, whoa, Nintendo, you've gone too far. Whoa, Nintendo, don't do this. Look at Disney. Disney has wielded aggressive copyright law for decades, and it's worked. It's a great strategy. It's an evil strategy, but it's a really powerful strategy. And it doesn't matter to Nintendo because their target demographic, ironically, it is sort of the casuals, but not in the same way Iwata viewed it. Iwata was trying to grab casual people and turn them into players, let them appreciate playing games and connecting with the art form, which I think is a very noble goal. That's not what Disney Nintendo's trying to do. Instead, Disney Nintendo is just trying to commodify their IPs and sell you shit and sell you nostalgia and merch, and it works. It works on me. It's going to work on all of us, especially as millennials have children. Yeah, I buy them Pokemon stuff. I buy them Zelda stuff, Mario stuff, because it's so deeply connected with my childhood. Of course, I want to pass it on to them. Nintendo did it. They have achieved that very long-term strategy of making these IPs and properties lucrative and multi-generational. And I think that's what they're ultimately going to end up doing for the foreseeable future. And I'm hoping at least more dedicated gamers become more wise to this and the rose-colored glasses start to dissipate a little bit. But it is what it is. I don't think there's anything that can be done about it except download all and back up all as many places as you can. I think that's really the only practical approach anyone can do. But another thing is, of course, taking a moment and reflecting back on, I think, the most underrated era of Nintendo and the era of Nintendo that I am personally the most interested in. So moving forward on the channel, you'll probably see me talking about Wii and WiiU games and some of them that really stand out to me. One of my most really full-fledged passionate videos I made on this channel was defending Star Fox Zero when it came out, and I wasn't exactly the most talented video editor and stuff back then, but I very much agree with what I said even to that day, so that might be a fun video to revisit. And if you enjoyed this video, I would say check out my review of the Castlevania Dominus collection, where I discuss the DS hardware and how it provided a shelter for Metroidvania style design. And I think that would be a great sort of companion piece to this video. And if you can, please support me on Patreon. I am a full-time YouTuber. Patreon is how I am able to continue doing what I do, and it's the model that I'm all in on and I think allows me the most creative freedom. And so if you could support me on Patreon, I'd really appreciate that. There's a lot of cool exclusive content on there. And thanks so much. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons, 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Ally, Autonamed, Battle Mode, Bo, Ben Foster, Beto Dames, Blade Symphony, Bog Hog, Board Bismati, Borgie22, Red Cox, Rosif Swagman, Captain Rhodes, Chase Palumbo, Shaflip, Chronic Burnout 3, Christopher R, Flarecliff, Flay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Concrete, Cooksan666, Cookson Soup, Corio, CSP 309000, Des Audio, DRK, Dan Matei, Dances with Incels, Danchi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, Dave Hansen, David Aldress, David Crespo, Didaidan, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Diodamke, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Eduardo Aquinta, Edvard, Elvin Senisev, Eleanor Moon, Elias Alonso, Empty Disco, Eric Houdini, Esteban Lazama, Explosive General Games, Fabio Pichi, Balkus, Fenich, Fiskin, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Retro Schmupper, Gods W Bomb, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hausu, Hero Death, On Harthy, HUD, Humongous, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, JBRPG, Jimmy Striggins, Jing Hans, JMV, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, Josaka, Gameboy Guru, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, Ken10082, Kill All Music, Kiss Kissian, Contain, Praise the Boys, Lingoblian, Ludwa, Loberta, Lord Harrington, Lorian, Luna Lalich, LZR Cuter, Mad Kabaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Mars Bar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Minung, Meister, Metal Slime Drummer, Mew Jam, Michael Polito, Michael McCord, Milady, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitward, Mitwid, Rogue, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Eco Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Ogre Mode, Okla Kugels, Oleg, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Howell Perot, Peace, Pedro Perez, Philip Plus, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Kulan Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Random, Raul, Rapido, RC, Realskeen, Renholtz Time, Retrojet, Retro Man, Riff Mason, Rip the Jacker, Robert Chang, Rory Starks, Wolf015, Salmon Connections, Sam, San Evo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Seesaw FW, Segfall, Shader Bunny, Chantak, Jazzy, Shifted, Shmup Junkie, Shmup Run, Sirapong, Social Kid, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synth Milk, Tamzarian, Tazrayu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Thom McCarthy, Tim French, TK Productions, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Tsugumo, Turam, 2YU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Unicorn Roots, Ursua, Ushimushi, Vic Viper, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Rena, Vulgarity, Wabby Legs, What Is This? Your Nerdy Joe, Zachary Patton, Zeal, Zenryoku.